Why is that?
So we want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Kizh Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamak, Serrano, Cahuilla, Payam-Cuichum, Ahashiman, Ipai-Tipai, the Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of the lands, river systems, and waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement, we invite you to visit the website of the USC Van Hunnick History Department, and we'll put a link to that in the chat shortly for those of you joining us online. Thank you all for being here. My name is Martha Stroud. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome a large audience here in person and those of you joining us on Zoom. For those of you on Zoom, we'd love to know where you're watching from, so feel free to tell us in the chat. We always love seeing the geographic reach of our audience. So we will have time for questions and discussion following the lecture, and we encourage questions from everybody in the room. And for those of you on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. And we're going to share the chat and the Q&A with Lauren following the lecture. So even if we can't get to all of the questions, she will see them as well as the comments afterwards. And we ask that for those of you online to please be respectful of each other and of the speaker. For those of you in person, you can see we have quite a Southern feast in honor of the Southern roots of our speaker today. We also have some Passover food for those of you observing Passover, and there are to-go containers in the back on the seat, the couch. So please take a hearty portion with you when you leave, because we're just gonna get rid of whatever food we don't successfully give away. So now to introduce today's speaker and today's lecture, it's my pleasure to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at USC, Wolf Gruner.
Thank you, Martha, as always, for the introduction, but also for the preparation of this event. Also, my thanks go to Autumn and also the graduate students who helped to organize and make everything ready for now. For those who don't know about the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, here a brief introduction. It was founded in 2014 here at USC, and our mission is to advance new areas of interdisciplinary research on genocide and mass violence. We promote research with the unique Holocaust and Genocide research resources and collections here at USC, which are really truly unique, including the Visual History Archive of the USC Shoah Foundation, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies book collection, and then also the archival collections and special collections here at Doheny at USC Libraries. We try to promote the transformation of the ways how we understand the origins, dynamics, and consequences of mass violence, as well as the conditions and dimensions of resistance to it. The center manages a rich academic program, including international conferences, bestowing numerous fellowships like this one today. And then we welcome also visiting scholars and organize lecture kind of workshops and lecture series. Today's lecture is to welcome our Breslauer, Rutman, and Anderson Research Fellowship holder. This fellowship enables advanced standing PhD candidates to spend up to a month here in residence at the center. It is a result of the generous gift of Gerald Breslauer, Mickey Rutman, and Tammy Anderson. We express our gratitude to them as well as to their colleague Megan Christensen for their support of this promising emerging scholars. And I think this is really important to highlight, that these fellowships enable us to bring innovative young scholars and give them a platform. So this year's fellowship holder is Lauren Ashley Bradford. She is currently a PhD candidate at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, right? This is the only program, by the way, which offers a PhD in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She earned her BA in History and German Studies from Gettysburg College. And already as an undergraduate, she published her first article, Through the Eyes of Children, Social Oppression Under Nazi Rule from 1933 to 1938, Reflections of Three Holocaust Survivors, which discusses the testimonies of three Berlin native child survivors of the Holocaust. It was published in the Gettysburg Historical Journal, an open access and peer-reviewed journal featuring the research of undergraduate students. From there, she went to get an MA in European History, Politics, and Society from Columbia University. And there, her master's thesis discussed how American relief policies and post-war strategies impacted Jewish displaced persons in Berlin from 1945 to 1948. You see here, there is some connection to Berlin here, which is great for me since I was born there, so I really appreciate it. For her research, Lauren has been awarded in the meantime various fellowships and awards from the variety of international institutions and organizations, including the European Research Infrastructure, which awarded her the Connie Crystal Fellowship. She was also fellow at the Leibniz Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, the Tauber Institute for the Study of European Jewry at Brandeis University, and the German Academic Exchange Service. So we are really honored to add this fellowship to her already long list of awards. And please join me in giving a warm welcome to Lauren Ashley Bradford.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here, for all of you being here. This is a great turnout. I'm very interested in my talk today. It's an honor to be here to talk about my dissertation research as the Breslauer, Rutman, and Anderson Research Fellow at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research here at USC. I'd like to start by expressing my sincere gratitude to Dr. Wolf Gruner for his continued interest in my project and his unwavering encouragement to disrupt conventional narratives and push back against any resistance or hesitancy I may have received toward my research. I'm especially grateful for Dr. Martha Stroud, whose unending kindness and support have touched every aspect of my fellowship experience, from our stimulating conversations about my project and the field more broadly, to her practical assistance with the VHA and navigating food spots in LA. Martha has become a definite friend during my time here. Both of their generosity and support have made the center feel so open and welcoming. And thank you to Autumn, not just for setting up, but I'm so glad that we got to join the center at the same time, and our conversations have been particularly appreciated, especially as I've prepared for today's talk. And a huge thank you to all the staff, faculty, staff, other fellows, graduate students, and undergraduate students who I've encountered during my time here. Each of you has contributed to creating such a welcoming and intellectual community that I've been incredibly grateful for. Finally, none of this work would be possible without the unwavering support of my partner, family, and friends, many of whom I'm so happy can zoom in and see this today. So bear with me as I have a lot to cover in a rather short period of time. I've tried to cut things out, but some things I really just held on to. So I'm going to speak really quickly, and whatever we miss or don't have time to go over, questions and answers is going to be a great time. So my plan for the talk, I'm going to begin with an introduction of the idea of being buried in the archive. Then I'll move on to introduce my project a bit more concretely itself, before providing some background information on the key points of either history that make it important to know for this comparative project, followed by 2 case studies, one of the East St. Louis riot of 1917 and one of the November pogrom in Niederbayern, Germany in 1938. And then we'll round it out with what I've been doing during my time here. I've been here for 2.5 weeks now, So what I've been doing as I've been working with the Virtual History Archive. So there we go. Women's absence. Women's absence from historical narratives is not merely accidental, but often the result of systematic erasure through archival and cataloging practices. Before the late 20th century, archives typically organized materials according to patriarchal assumptions about importance and relevance. Women's contributions were frequently subsumed under their husbands' or fathers' names in finding aids and catalogs, effectively rendering them invisible to researchers unless specifically sought out. These antiquated indexing practices reflect the social structures of their time. When women's correspondence was archived, it was often categorized as domestic or personal, rather than political or intellectual, regardless of content, a false dichotomy that devalued traditionally feminine domains. Additionally, collections were often built around the great men of history, with women appearing only in relation to these figures, rather as subjects worthy of documentation in their own right. The practices of archives themselves further compounded this problem. Acquisition decisions historically privileged male materials from men in positions of power and influence. Women's diaries, letters, and creative works were less likely to be sought out or preserved, especially those from marginalized communities, and class often played a massive factor in this decision-making. When women's materials were collected, they were often deemed less worthy of proper cataloging resources or detailed description, making them functionally inaccessible, even when physically present in collections. And let me tell you, this archival science is particularly pronounced when searching for evidence of women as perpetrators of violence. Such documentation challenges dominant gender narratives that cast women solely as victims, pacifying influences, the occasional intellectual or suffragist. Historical records of women and violence were frequently pathologized, with their actions attributed to mental illness or moral corruption, rather than agency or political motivation. Court records often minimize women's roles in violent crimes, especially when a male accomplice is involved, which we can get to more later. In many cases, evidence of women's violence was, and to an extent still is, deliberately obscured or destroyed because it contradicted prevailing social norms about feminine nature and behavior. Cataloging systems rarely include subject headings or descriptive terms that would identify women's participation in warfare, rebellion, or criminal violence, making systematic research incredibly difficult and time-consuming. The selective preservation and indexing creates a distorted historical record that continues to influence contemporary understandings of gender and violence. This archival silence creates a circular problem. The perceived and real absence of women in archives leads to their absence in historical narratives, which in turn reinforces assumptions about their limited historical importance, leading to continued neglect in collection policies. The result is not just missing pages in our history books, but fundamental misunderstandings about how societies functioned and evolved. And this is where my work comes in. My project confronts a double erasure within these historical archives, both the absence of women as perpetrators of violence and the suppression or lessening of Jim Crow's brutal realities. Traditional historiography has relegated women to supportive but not active roles in physical racial violence, focusing instead on male actors while ignoring female agency in maintaining systems of oppression. Simultaneously, the documentation of Jim Crow violence has been deliberately obscured through euphemistic language, the destruction or classification of investigative reports, and the institutional protection of white perpetrators who supposedly attacked at the hands of persons unknown. By methodically excavating these intersecting silences, examining court records, personal testimonies, and newspapers against their grain, my research reveals how archival practices themselves have been complicit in constructing sanitized narratives that exclude both women's capacity for violence and the full extent of anti-Black terrorism. This work demonstrates what appears as an absence in the archive often represents deliberate mechanisms of forgetting, requiring alternative methodological approaches that can recover histories intentionally buried by those who created and maintained these repositories of memory. In addition to turning to smaller local archives and history initiatives that often offer more details, personal testimonies, and more comprehensive insight into these spaces and historical actors, a lot of this work requires time, patience, and if you're in Germany, a lot of emails and dealing with data protection laws. So I'm saying all of this at the beginning because in preparing the title for this talk in advance, I knew that coming to the center and working with the VHA, I would likely have a similar experience that I've had at all the other archives I've been to and databases I've searched. I need time to sift through each testimony because there are no indexing terms for women perpetrators. But I'll get to the VHA later in my talk. First, I'll give an example of a different database that I've used and how I was able to collect one of my biggest source cases or bases, which is post-war trial records. I located these records through the NSG database at the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, as I was a fellow there this time last spring, which has easily been the most influential thing for my project that I could have done. The database was started in 1999 through collaboration with the Yad Vashem, with the goal of cataloging all investigative and criminal proceedings relating to National Socialist crimes since 1945 in the two German states. The database encompasses approximately 38,000 proceedings from West Germany and 15,000 from East Germany, and includes basic information on the location, accusations, and outcomes of the case, as well as the locations of the original procedural documents. The database has been available since 2013, but is incredibly tricky to navigate, especially with my project in mind, as a lot of the files are missing information such as gender, and others where women's names are visible in the record often come with a description that leaves them out of it. With this in mind, I decided to comb the entire database in alphabetical order by last name to find all of them. Although a tedious task that took several months, I'm glad I took the time to do this, as I was able to not only guarantee that I would find all of the women in the database, but I got a better understanding of the different kinds of violence involved in these trials, the geographic spread of the violence itself, and the locations. Oh, sorry. Funny. The locations of the original records that I would then go.
Oh,
Yeah, that's the feedback thing. I'm just waiting. Okay. And the locations of the original records that I would then go out and collect. So of all 53,000 records in this database, which by the way is more than double that of names that I had to look through, there are approximately 10,000 trials that are involving women, of which I decided 400 to 500 of these trials are relevant for my project. And I have now gone and collected 150 of the trials. And so that's what this map is for. These are all the archives that I had to go to collect these trials.
Wow.
Thank you. I'm actually also waiting for more archive files to be coming from the Stasi archive, but in a classic case, the German archive system, it takes forever. So with a small glimpse into what some components of my research process can look like at an archival level, I want to introduce my project more concretely and get into some of the cases that I found while doing this work. So my doctoral dissertation, With Blood on Their Stockings, Women's Public Participation in Racial Terror in Nazi Germany and Jim Crow America, compares two groups of women who openly took part in violence and brutality, Aryan women helping to fuel the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and Austria on the one hand, and white supremacist women committing anti-Black violence throughout the United States during the era of Jim Crow on the other. While Jim Crow is a long era of violence, I've chosen to look solely at the years 1919 to 1945 for the purpose of this comparative project, and we can get into that in the Q&A if you want to know more why. While prior scholarship proves valuable in its analysis of these women's traditional roles and career paths, such as mothers, nurses, teachers, secretaries, and camp guards, this project explores women's participation in public displays of racial violence. In order to examine the intersection of gender, race, and perpetration, the women in this project are analyzed through their actions and reactions within several distinct settings and forms of violence. These are pogroms, lynchings, and individual and communal acts of brutality and humiliation. In doing so, I intend to discern how women subverted, transgressed, or confirmed societal gender roles through their actions, and explore the ways in which they produced and participated in cultural violence, and interrogate the social structures that permitted and compelled their participation. By analyzing women's involvement in public violence across urban and rural spaces, my research reveals how women helped construct and maintain landscapes of terror that fundamentally altered the geographic and social fabric of their communities. I'll be looking at cities such as Berlin, Vienna, and Chicago, and rural spaces like Niederrhein, Bavaria, Early County, Georgia, and LaFleur County, Mississippi. I'd be happy to go over more about why I chose this location also in the Q&A. In both cases, women's participation in physical and verbal abuse transformed ordinary civic spaces into sites of racial persecution, effectively shaping or reshaping how targeted groups navigated and existed within these environments. Through their actions, these women didn't merely participate in existing structures of oppression, they actively constructed new social and physical boundaries aimed at controlling how marginalized groups existed within these societies. Understanding women's roles in creating these geographies of violence provides crucial insight into how gender intersects with racism and racial hierarchies to shape the lived experiences of both perpetrators and victims in these ostensibly patriarchal societies. So now I'm going to give a brief background on both of the histories. I will try to go fast, but I couldn't leave this out. So for our first case, Nazi Germany, the Nazi rise to power did not occur in a vacuum, but was built upon longstanding currents of racism, nationalism, and anti-Semitism in German society. After the turn of the 20th century, Germany underwent major upheaval, the collapse of the German Empire after World War I, the tumultuous birth of the Weimar Republic, and years of economic turmoil fueled by hyperinflation and unemployment. This instability intensified the polarization between left and right-wing political factions. Extremist voices on the far right exploited pre-existing anti-Semitic prejudices, scapegoating Jews for Germany's failures. These narratives drew upon centuries of entrenched hatred across European history and combined them with the popular race science of the day. The Nazis channeled this vilification of Jews into a coherent racist ideology that defined German identity in opposition to a perceived Jewish other. Their propaganda, heavily influenced by the US, dehumanized Jews on racial grounds, labeling them an existential threat to the contrived concept of Aryan purity. After becoming chancellor in 1933, Hitler and the Nazis rapidly dismantled the albeit failing democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic and established a dictatorship under which all dissenting parties were crushed. The process of purifying and safeguarding the vaunted Aryan master race began almost immediately. The regime's priorities centered on codifying their racist worldview into law and policy in order to identify, isolate, and remove Jews and other undesirables from the national community. Within 2 years, the 1935 Nuremberg race laws institutionalized Nazi racial anti-Semitism. These laws stripped Jews of citizenship and civil rights, outlawing any sexual relationships or marriages with Aryan Germans. Waves of anti-Semitic violence occurred throughout the country during the pre-war years, with the November pogrom, Reichskristallnacht, being a culminating moment that I will discuss at length later in this presentation. Over the span of 12 years, those subjected to Nazi violence were systematically eradicated from every facet of society. They were forcibly expelled from the workplace and communities, stripped of their rights and citizenships, deported eastward to ghettos and camps, and ultimately murdered. Even after the turning point in the war, Nazi leadership persisted in its murderous policies, relying on the cooperation of government agencies, local collaborators, and the support or indifference of the general population. The victims, some 6 million Jews and around 5 million others, met their demise based on their chosen or imposed identities. Switching to Jim Crow. The subjugation and devaluation of Black lives in America is rooted in its very foundation through the centuries of brutal chattel slavery that existed well before emancipation and the Civil War. This system built an entire culture around dehumanizing and commoditizing Black bodies. Following Reconstruction's end in 1877, the federal government abandoned efforts to protect the rights of newly freed Black people in the South. Southern and border states moved quickly to enact discriminatory Jim Crow laws, codifying the systematic subjugation of Black communities. It's important to know that Jim Crow was more than a series of harmful, oppressive, anti-Black laws meant to disenfranchise Black people and maintain white supremacy. It was the custom, culture, and way of life. Jim Crow was the social and legal legitimization of anti-Black racism. Politicians, ministers, doctors, and judges, people at every educational level and from all major institutions, supported and spread the belief that Black people were intellectually and culturally inferior to white people. From visible segregation signage and unequal facilities to children's board games and popular books and films, this ideology permeated all aspects of society. Underpinning Jim Crow was brutal violence against Black people that took many forms, but is epitomized in the practice of racial terror lynchings. These lynchings were widely attended, with as few as 3 people to as many as 15,000 in attendance. White reporters described the torture in graphic detail. Photos of the victims were made into postcards, often with the perpetrators posing next to them with big smiling faces, and body parts were scavenged from the victims' bodies for souvenirs, later to be displayed in shop windows and family homes. Yet almost every murder was done at the hands of persons unknown. Studying these overlapping histories challenges us to recognize how racial ideologies transcend national boundaries and can mutually reinforce each other. It reveals how systems of oppression are built not just through outright hatred, but through legal structures, cultural norms, and pseudoscientific justifications. Understanding these connections provides vital context for addressing contemporary manifestations of racial violence and discrimination, reminding us that the struggle against such systems requires vigilance across borders and continuous examination of our own institutions. So now I'll be switching to the East St. Louis massacre, which occurred in 1917, which technically is outside of my timeline parameters, but because it was the first case of violence that I came across in my research and has heavily influenced me, I still use it and will be using it in the introduction to my dissertation. So, the US entering the First World War came with the loss of cheap foreign labor that fueled the factories supplying the war effort, as many who emigrated to the US from Europe returned to their home countries to fight, and other would-be workers were drafted or enlisted in the US military. There were labor shortages in major cities like East St. Louis that found solutions in recruiting Black laborers to fill these positions. The Great Migration, having already begun in the early 1910s, had many of these cities experiencing a mass influx of Black Americans looking to escape the poor economic conditions and racial discrimination of the South. Labor disputes, union-employer relation agitation, and the hiring of Black strikebreakers further exacerbated the pre-existing and growing tensions in these spaces, making this a period of frequent labor and race-related violence. The extreme violence that culminated in what I refer to as the East St. Louis massacre, as opposed to race riot, was preceded by another outbreak of anti-Black violence on May 28th. After a meeting at a town hall between the mayor, white labor union reps, and some 1,000 white workers resulted in the crowd storming into nearby Black saloons, attacking patrons at random, and resulting in a handful of deaths, both Black and white. They were suppressed by the state militia. However, tensions remained and would build until the evening of July 1st, when 2 Black men were attacked by a group of 7 or 8 white men while trying to switch streetcars in the center of the town. It was around the same time that across town in the Black neighborhood, a Ford automobile full of white men was seen joyriding through the Black neighborhood, indiscriminately firing their pistols into the homes. Shifting our focus back to the center of town, one of the men who had been attacked when switching at the streetcar stop, despite being injured from a gunshot wound, was able to escape and run back to the Black part of town to alert the residents there. It's there that they were able to gather together some 300 residents and arm themselves in preparation for an attack. Reports of a group of Black people assembling were, unsurprisingly, sent to the police. The police sergeant and 3 detectives, all dressed in plain civilian clothing, responding to these reports, drove to that area of town in a Ford automobile. With little time lapsing between the appearance of both vehicles, the now prepared Black residents opened fire on the second car, unaware of the vehicle's passengers, with the sergeant killed on the spot and at least 1 other officer wounded and later that day dying from his injuries. When news of the sergeant's death reached the police department, the police afforded no further protection of any kind for the Black residents of East St. Louis. Rather, many were seen joining in on the destruction and murder that took place the following morning. And it's on this morning of July 2nd that the bullet-riddled car was left outside of the police station, arguably on purpose, drawing hundreds of onlookers. Nearby, crowds gathered at the Labor Temple where inflammatory speeches and plans for attacking the Black parts of town were being made. What happened next was not spontaneous, but methodical. Thousands of white men, women, and children took to the streets, cutting off the fire department's water hoses, setting fire to Black homes and businesses, shooting and beating Black people indiscriminately and lynching others. And women were a key part of this violence. White women and men targeted all Black people regardless of age or gender. The headlines of the following day stated, "Well-dressed girls and women, hair flying and clothing covered in blood, led unit of the mob." And women and girls participate in wild demonstrations, help drag Blacks from cars to be beaten. I should also add that the title of my dissertation, "With Blood on Their Stockings," is one of the headlines from this event. Ida B. Wells, who's seen here, famous journalist, mother of the civil rights movement, and one of the founders of the NAACP, traveled to East St. Louis in the immediate aftermath to investigate and collect testimony as the representative of the Colored Citizens of Chicago group. One of the testimonies Wells recorded was of a Black woman, Miss Dolly Bruton, who watched the events unfold as she was hiding in her house. Wells wrote, "The streetcars ran right along in front of her house, and she saw white women stop the streetcars and pulled off colored women and beat them. One woman's clothes they tore off entirely, and then they took off their shoes and beat her over the face and head with their shoe heels. Another woman who got away ran down the street with every stitch of clothing torn off her back, leaving her with only her shoes and stockings. Other, even more graphic accounts covered in one of the hearings in the months following the massacre involved groups of white women shooting Black women, holding children, and throwing their babies back into the flames of the fires. Wells' report from July 3rd, titled The History of the East St. Louis Race Riot, was deemed such a potential threat to the desired swift resolution to the violence that the United States Military Intelligence Division on Negro Subversives confiscated the report and classified it top secret, where it would remain sealed until 1986. However, the 65th Congress was able to access the report and decide to create a subcommittee to investigate the massacre more closely after reading her findings. The 6,000 pages of sworn testimony and evidence that came out of their investigation were found to be so disturbing that only a 24-page summary of it was published, with the original testimony only being unearthed from the archives in more recent years. Local militia groups that had been tasked with suppressing the violence also took part in the brutality of the massacre, purposely unarming the Black residents before turning their bayonets on them as well. It was only after the Illinois National Guard finally intervened on July 3rd that the violence subsided. The official death toll stood at 48, though reports range anywhere from 100 to as many as 500 deaths. The exact number will never be known, as one woman reporter from the Red Cross noted that there was no way to account for the countless Black people thrown into the Mississippi River, burned in their homes, and buried in mass graves. Over 300 Black homes and businesses were destroyed, and 6,000 to 7,000 residents of the city fled entirely, never to return. The mass violence that erupted over the course of 2 days emerged within a complex context of political corruption, labor disputes, racial animosity, and sensational media coverage. However, the fundamental driver that prompted hundreds of white East St. Louis residents to commit organized systematic violence against the Black community was their profound anxiety about Black residents potentially gaining social, economic, and political influence. This fear of shifting power dynamics ultimately motivated what can accurately be characterized as a massacre. Unlike East St. Louis, which involved various lower and middle-level government officials, Kristallnacht was a planned attack against German and Austrian Jews carried out by the SA and SS, with the Hitler Youth and an unknown thousands of citizens joining in to participate. The pretext for the attacks was the assassination of German diplomat Ernst von Rath by a young Polish Jew, Herschel Grinspan, living in Paris. Thousands of homes, synagogues, businesses, and schools were destroyed, with some 30,000 Jewish men arrested and taken to concentration camps, and at least 91 Jews were murdered. Of course, these estimates are very low, and most range much higher than the reported amount. Examples from the day in relation to my research include in Dusseldorf, a German woman was seen sexually humiliating a 70-year-old Jewish man. She drove the man from his home in his nightshirt, which she lifted in order to expose him in front of a staring crowd. In another city, a German woman was seen punching a Jewish man soon after he had been harassed by a group of men outside of a nearby synagogue. Evidence of women's involvement was not as blatantly posted in the papers following the event, but eyewitness accounts and reports have demonstrated how women were active participants. Which leads me to, okay. I should preface this section first by saying that due to German data protection laws that I keep mentioning, I have had to change the names, or at least use partial names, of the non-Jewish Germans involved in this case, which is a whole other conversation. But I digress. So we'll now be jumping into a more in-depth look at the November pogrom, but in this town of Niederwern. First, I wanted to provide some background on the town itself and the Jewish community. That goes back to at least the 17th century, with a rather large Jewish population. For the town size of 700. The Jewish population peaked in the 1840s at about 308 people, with the number shrinking already by the 1860s to only 90 Jewish inhabitants, by the 1910s. It drops further to 45 inhabitants by the 1930s, and after the pogrom, this number drops to 29 by 1939, with several more immigrating within the following 2 years. On September 23rd, 1942, the remaining 5 Jews of Niederwern were deported to Theresienstadt and perished either there or in Auschwitz. Approximately 38 Jews from Niederwern were murdered during the Holocaust. For this particular case, which, thinking back to the database that I was talking about and the trial records that I'm using, there were about 1,000 pages in this one case. 7 women and 29 men were tried for their actions. And although I won't be focusing on the convictions of the trials in my work, as I'm more curious about the content of what people are saying happened, 3 of the 7 women would go on to serve time, which only averaged about 6 months to a year in a labor camp. 50 SA men were sent to Niedervan on this day, and there was significant participation by the population. Okay. In order to show the kind of details this case provides and to get a clear sense of how the pogrom progressed, we will be following the path of one of the women who was eventually found guilty for her part in the day's violent events. And that is Elizabeth here. Also, I don't know if you can all see, let me know if you can't, but this is the hand-drawn map of the town of Niedervan that was used in the trial. So Elizabeth is at home with Hildegard, whose house I've yet to map, shows up around 2 in the afternoon to tell her about the events unfolding in the town. She requests that Elizabeth join her in watching the Jews get beaten up. The two head out to the Gottlob house, where they mainly see a group of men dressed in a mix of uniforms and civilian clothing, breaking windows and destroying furniture. They then walk past Ida Hamburger's house, where they encounter a similar scene. It is there that Elizabeth sees 76-year-old Clara Schatzman walking down the street, as well as Maria, another woman who's on trial for her crimes. Together, Elizabeth and Maria quickly approach Clara and both slap her on the face. In their accounts of the events, Elizabeth and Maria say it's out of revenge for the times that Clara would harass their children. There's no proof of this ever occurring, and Clara Schatzman flees in the direction of the house belonging to her Jewish neighbors, the Bildsteins. It is at the Bildsteins' house that I want to focus our attention, as it's here that we are introduced to Augusta, another woman who's on trial. Outside of the Bildsteins' home, a crowd has formed as SA men are seen throwing various goods and valuables out the windows. Many people, kids and adults, are seen trying to grab the clothing, silverware, and cakes that have been removed from the home. As a group of children go to grab one of the cakes, Augusta shouts loudly, causing many around her to comment as she stomps on the cake with her foot. She shouts that no one is to have any of the Jewish items. They must all be destroyed. She even requests that all the silverware be given to her to destroy personally, which she proceeds to do in front of those in attendance. Several people recall seeing this particular scene when giving their testimony for the trial. There's even one person who remembers seeing Augusta play football with the eggs in the front yard of one of the Jewish homes. Augusta is one of the many who follows the crowd from home to home, continuously destroying everything that she comes across. But back to Elizabeth. She follows the crowd to Clara Schatzman's home, but it had been already destroyed early in the day and she is no longer home as she is hiding. So people don't stay very long. They pass by Louisa Hessline's house where the destruction continues, and 3 SA men who had been previously at all of the other homes, we'll call them Johannes, Felix, and Hans, are visible among the perpetrators. The next house Elizabeth stops at is the Gutmann home, where Gretchen, another woman on trial, joins in. At the Gutmann home, Johannes is seen throwing Rosa Gutmann's radio out the window. Rosa cries out that it is a German made and it shouldn't be destroyed, after which Elizabeth, Augusta, and Gretchen all grab Rosa by the shoulders and punch her in the face. In her report, Elizabeth states that she would like to know that Augusta hit Rosa with all of her violence and might. Elizabeth and Gretchen then leave with the crowd and head back towards the Bildsteins' home. It is at this moment that they see Clara again emerging from the house. Maria is also in the crowd, and upon seeing Clara, she cries out, "Here comes Frau Schatzman, we will really beat her up this time." All 3 women grab Clara and repeatedly punch and kick her. They then decide that they want to throw her into the van, so they begin to drag her by her arms and hair in the direction of the river. A crowd follows them. Johannes, from earlier, crosses their path towards the river, holding a box that appeared to be stolen from a Jewish home. He then shouts to them, "Hit her to death." In their retelling of the events, Elizabeth and Gretchen say that this interaction made them nervous, and they realized maybe they should go home. However, they continue with their abuse by shoving Clara into a muddy horse trough. They proceed to do this 3 times in front of a crowd that followed. Johannes repeats to himself, saying, "Hit her dead." At this point, all 3 women decide to leave Clara in the water and walk towards the Jewish houses being destroyed in the town. Instead of returning home, like they originally stated, they continue on to the home of Bella Steinheimer and then to the Jewish school, with the final stop of their destructive path being the synagogue. The last scene that I want to quickly describe occurs from inside the synagogue, and we are no longer following Elizabeth's path as she is outside. Inside the synagogue, two men in SA uniform are seen arguing about setting the synagogue on fire. The one in charge, Johannes, notes that he has orders to set the synagogue on fire and that he's commanding the other man, Gustav, to do so. Gustav's wife, Rosa, is with them as she has also followed the crowd, watching the destruction throughout the day. Rosa speaks up, asking her husband to take her home and to not burn the synagogue down. Johannes responds by insulting Gustav, telling him he doesn't deserve to be an SA man because he is listening to his wife in the situation and threatens to report him. Wolfgang, a man who testifies as seeing this interaction, says that it wasn't much later that he saw them exiting the synagogue, with smoke now rising from it, and assumes that Gustav set the fire. And just a quick reminder for this scene that Johannes is the same man who told Elizabeth, Gretchen, and Maria to kill Clara earlier. While I have not finished tracing the movements of each Jewish family in this case, I know that the Gutmann family immigrated soon after the pogrom, and Clara Schatzmann was one of the 5 remaining Jews of Niederbayern, transported to Theresienstadt in September of 1942, where she dies 5 months later at the age of 81 in early 1943. While this is only a brief introduction to the November pogrom in Niederbayern, it provides a glimpse of the kind of violence perpetrated by women. I know the Jewish perspective is currently absent from this presentation, which I intend to rectify through oral and written testimony during my time here. And as I continue to work through this case, I do know that there are some letters from John, Rosa, and Felix Gutmann that discuss their experiences of anti-Semitism in Niederbayern more broadly and are used as evidence for the trial. As I work through these cases, my main aim is to ask, as Marion Kaplan and many others have famously done in their work, what new things do we learn about this event when we look at it from the perspective of or focusing on women? After reading through the cases I've been collecting, my understanding of the November pogrom has greatly expanded. While we know the violence began and ended on different days in different regions across Germany, one of the most surprising things I found through following these women's retellings of the events is the time of day that it occurs. While most texts discuss the violence taking place in the late hours of the night or early hours of the morning, the women I've researched are participating during the daytime. Although it doesn't come up in Elizabeth's account, many of these women describe their participation in the day surrounding meal times and feeding and clothing their children. Rosa, the woman who tells Gustav not to burn down the synagogue, mentions returning home to her son in order to feed him before the two of them set back out to continue being spectators to the violence. Additionally, although again not in Elizabeth's account, what people are wearing is heavily discussed, often demonstrating how one's clothing could be a tool of violence. In a town near this one, women were stealing bottles of wine and carrying them home in their aprons. Others were using their aprons to hold stones while they threw them through the windows of Jewish shops and homes. Women have also included descriptions of other townspeople clearly dressed in the stolen wardrobes and jewels of their Jewish neighbors. Another area of note, motivations are becoming more and more apparent. Women are openly seen seeking revenge for past wrongdoings, like Elizabeth claims in regard to Clara. They're also admitting to seeking financial gain through stolen goods and expressing hatred for their Jewish neighbors' status or wealth, acting out with apparent racist hatred and commitment to Nazi ideology and more. Although I've only just begun, I'm also looking forward to analyzing the language used to describe these women, as many of their peers pointed to their appearance in rather gendered terms, although it's not clear yet what the pattern is here. For example, many referred to Gretchen as crazed and wild when she was seen playing football with the stolen eggs, but there has been limited response in the testimony so far to the women physically beating Clara or Rosa Gutmann when acting in some of the most extreme cases, as they burned Torah scrolls or chased a fleeing Jewish neighbor. Whoops, there's also that. Or I'll leave it there. So through my time with the Visual History Archive, although my time has been limited to just 2 weeks, the challenges I've encountered mirror the broader archival silences discussed earlier. I should first note that the VHA is a great tool and a database that I'm thankful to have access to for over the next year, holding 58,957 testimonies of genocide survivors, not just the Holocaust. It will be invaluable for my project, especially once I've had time to work through it. Unfortunately, the VHA lacks specific indexing terms for perpetrators and women as perpetrators. They appear only through indirect searches via professional categories like guards, nurses, or teachers. And this structural limitation has forced me to devise creative search combinations, but I have yet to find testimony that discusses the violent actions of women at length. I've only gone through a little over 60 testimonies, so there's still plenty of time for me to listen to them and find more. Nevertheless, the available testimonies provide invaluable insight into the everyday racism and oppression Jews navigated in these hostile environments. One significant discovery was the testimony of Ilse Schwarz Gutmann, which, if we can all remember 5 seconds ago, Ilse is from Niederrhein, and she was a child at the time and lived in this house. I don't know if you can see over here. While she doesn't specifically address the women perpetrators that I've discussed, her first-hand account enriches my understanding of the life in Niederrhein and the pogrom experience from a survivor's perspective. And we will listen to what she has to say.
And they destroyed a lot of the wooden furniture too. I took an axe and it was a
Inside the
mess.
house?
Pardon?
All inside the house?
Yes, yes, inside the house.
Were
It
you
slipped the bicycle tires, all but mine, I think. I don't know why mine was. Maybe I had it inside, I'm not sure.
where were you at the time when this was happening? Did
I
you
was at these other people's house. So,
were these non-Jews or Jews that you in whose house you were
I
at?
was in Jews, you know, they came, they destroyed it. They only did it to Jews.
So when you came to your house, when you saw it, what went through your mind when you saw that?
I saw it out, and there were people standing around, and I thought, well, I'm too late. They've already been here. I thought I could warn my mother. And then we had a very nice neighbor, and he was coming from the field at the time. And while he was coming around the corner, this woman shouted something obscene to my mother about Jews, you know. So he said, he cracked his whip and he said, "Leave Mrs. Gutmann alone," in German, naturally. So that night I think they broke his window. So after that, we never spoke to them. We didn't want anything to happen to them. At least not in public, maybe out in the field or something like that.
So from this short clip of testimony where she is talking about her experiences of the November pogrom, and actually let me quickly go back. Well, her house is over here. She was at a friend's house all the way over here. And so by the time she tried to make it to her mother to warn her of what had been happening, it was already too late. And I found it really interesting that the one moment she does talk about briefly when she says a woman shouted something at my mother, it does come up in the trial records. I did find evidence of this guy, whose name I cannot tell you. He's one of the only non-Jewish residents of Niederrhein to go around trying to protect some of his Jewish neighbors. And then, as we heard, he then has his own house attacked later that evening. So this testimony is particularly striking when considered alongside documentary evidence I encountered. And then this final clip that I will quickly show to you. Okay. Right, this final clip represents one of the clearest examples of women's violence that I found so far, although it is verbal violence, and its profound impact that it had on the survivor, Abraham Grossman, who was a child at the time as well.
And I noticed especially that a young woman holding a baby in her hand, and she looked so ordinary, and I thought maybe she would have some compassion on her face that the house of God was burning, but not so. She said, I remember the words like today, she said, "It's about time that the Jews know what the Germans are." She said in German, of course, this is a translation, but it seems to be in my mind. It's never left me when she said it, because it made such an impression on me that a woman holding a baby would look on without compassion, without pity, that a synagogue should be burning.
This testimony deserves further analysis, as do both of them, especially considering the parallel imagery of women holding babies at lynchings. It's a well-documented phenomenon in racial terror lynchings, And the presence of children at both lynchings and pogroms brought by their mothers raises profound questions about intergenerational transmission of hatred and the socialization of violence. I look forward to exploring these connections further, both in my research and in our discussion. But I want to conclude by, that as we conclude today's discussion, I want to emphasize why this comparative study of women perpetrators of violence in Nazi Germany and Jim Crow America demands our urgent scholarly attention. The timeliness of this research cannot be overstated. In an era where white nationalist movements are resurgent globally and gendered assumptions continue to shape our understanding of violence, examining women's participation in historical systems of oppression provide critical insight into how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary violence. These overlapping histories, though separated by geography, reveal striking parallels in how white supremacist ideologies recruited and mobilized women as active agents in maintaining racial hierarchies. The comparative framework illuminates how gendered expectations paradoxically both constrained women's actions and provided unique opportunities for their participation in violent regimes. It also reveals how archival practices and historical scholarship have doubly marginalized these stories, first through the erasure of women's agency, and second, through the compartmentalization of histories that share important commonalities. By centering marginalized groups in this analysis, both as victims of systemic violence and as complex historical actors, we gain crucial perspective on how intersecting oppressions operate. This research demonstrates that examining the actions of perpetrators, particularly those who defy our expectations, deepens our understanding of how systems of domination function and persist. It shows us that violence is not an aberration perpetrated only by monstrous individuals, but is sustained through everyday actions, choices, and silences by ordinary people across gender lines. The excavation of these difficult histories serves not to sensationalize violence, but to confront the complex realities of human behavior under oppressive regimes. By understanding how women participated in and benefited from these systems, we better comprehend the full machinery of racial violence, knowledge that remains essential for dismantling its contemporary manifestations. And to conclude, it is in preparing for this talk that I came across a few headlines that I think further point to the importance and timeliness of this research, as academic institutions and state libraries across the country have begun to openly erase the exact histories that I'm searching for and spent this presentation talking about.
So much. That was a mic drop way to end your talk. So now we're going to open it up for questions. And for those of you on Zoom, again, just please use the Q&A feature. And I'm just going to grab the laptop, if that's okay.
Thank you for such a really fascinating talk, and I could hear you talk about it for hours and hours on end, but I did want to ask for you to explain a little bit of why you chose the dates for the Jim Crow portion of your dissertation and how you went about like narrowing down what period you were looking at for the American segment.
Happily. So while Jim Crow is like such a broad period of time, I of course knew that would not work for such a comparative project when you're working with only 12 years of Nazi Germany. So not only is the fact that it's overlapping a benefit, but what had me start even at 1919 is the fact that it is the interwar period. It therefore mimics or mirrors better for this comparative project. And Jim Crow had already within it its own like segmentations. So you have the immediate post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction period through to right around the turn of the century, with the increase and the Great Migration finally occurring. And as that's happening, you also have it segmented with the start of the First World War, and historians often will either use that whole block or block it off just by the First World War, and then move on from there. So I kind of decided to park myself in the middle, 1919 to 1945, just for the ease of the comparative project and because it has been done before.
So maybe this question's unfair because I'm asking about something that happened in 1955 as a reference, but when I think about racial terror, committed by women in the South. I think about Emmett Till first, and I think about this episode which was gestured to in the presentation, where it's not the physical violence that is significant about her involvement in the violence itself, but the overreaction, which is still kind of mystifying what actually happened. Talking about Carolyn Bryant and Emmett Till, providing this kind of overreaction by men to protect her perceived threatened white femininity. And that's something that I know a lot of research has been done in the US context on like white women as something in danger, needing protection, right? Kind of instigating racial terror. But I wonder if you're exploring any comparative cases in Germany, or if that's an analytic that you're working with, kind of gender initial trigger before the violence takes place within this scope.
So great question. The short answer is not really, but the longer answer is maybe. So essentially, yes, there are instances where, I mean, I would point to like the Rassenschande parades. So like the race defilement parades that were happening in Germany when a Jewish man or woman would have sexual relationships or would be married to a non-Jewish person after 1935. This was no longer allowed. And so these parades looked like these men and women being paraded through the streets, getting harassed, mocked. I mean, some people were beaten. You had to hold a sign saying that you are shameful and dirty and all the other things. And so there is kind of this already like they're pointing it to, we're protecting, like, you know, there is that racial blood bit. We're protecting our group. If you do this, this is what happens to you. And I know that there are some other cases where the response to these relationships is a bit more outbursts of physical violence, or women, maybe even more. Sorry, I'm thinking through this as I'm saying it. And women either pointing to, often in terms of like a denunciation, someone that they're trying to denounce, and the violence is then enacted that way, which would maybe even be more similar. Because I will definitely be using it. You don't have to go to 1955, you can go to well before that. I will definitely be using women as actors of non-physical violent ways, as they are pointing to these men, and often, I should add, frequently after, say that either the wrong person was got, or there was no one to begin with, and this was on purpose. So in these moments where they are denouncing this person and there is this wave of violence, there are some cases in the German side that I could see using. However, I wanted to point out, and maybe I didn't, for me, violence is physical, is the first. And that's the reason why I'm going towards physical violence first, is because it's like the most not done. Right. And I kind of wanted to be like, well, it happened, so let's talk about it. But that's not to say that I'm not going to be talking about the more verbal or other forms of physical violence, like a denunciation, because it's necessary, but they're not the main focal point of my project. Sorry if that was like so many points there.
Yeah, well, first of all, that was amazing. I want to know how you do PowerPoints. Really fascinating. Two things. First of all, I wanted to pick up on what you raised in a slightly different focus, which is whether, and I know it's really hard to get at this, but whether there is any evidence of those kind of hurled insults, or specifically referring not so much to the sort of Rassenschande aspect, but to Jewish men as sexual predators, right? As being threats to the virtue and the purity of German women, which was such a central, I mean, that's what you were talking about, right? Which was such a central part of accusations in lynching cases, for example, right? I mean, and in colonial violence, this notion that of sexual threat to white women. So whether that would be another, another potential point of comparison. And then I mean, this is, I don't even think we have time to discuss this right now, but it's just that, your intervention, moves like right to the heart of this problem that, so many people have been turning themselves upside down and inside out, trying to, think about, which is the relationship between, quote, racism, right, and, quote, anti-Semitism. And, are these concepts that are, is anti-Semitism an aspect of racism? How is it particular? How can one talk about them? This is obviously, a very, sort of difficult, challenging question for all of us right now. And you have like moved yourself right into the center of it. And so I'd be so interested in hearing just, I know this is a much longer conversation, but your thoughts on that, and also maybe a little bit about the kind of challenges you face in terms of doing that, this comparison.
Thank you for those questions. I'll start with the first one. So, I mean, admittedly, of the 150 trials that I've collected, I've gone through a very small fraction. And I know that somewhere I collected a trial where there was a denunciation of a woman, or like a woman was denouncing a Jewish man, and there was it was in protection of her daughter. She was worried that they were going to have a relationship or something. So it's there. I have not gotten to it, and I happily would use it as a point of comparison, and do that in the side-by-side. So it will likely be a chapter. I hope many of you can see me present again once I've actually finished the research. I'm sure I have a lot more to say and a lot more concrete answers. And then for the relationship between racism and anti-Semitism, I mean, for my project, maybe I don't know, I spent obviously a lot of time thinking about this, but in terms of what I'm doing and what I've found, I'm using like racialized anti-Semitism and kind of just throwing the word racism in there as a coverall, because as the Nazis have put it down, and as like you can do almost a side-by-side, like of the treatment of Jews and the thoughts around them on the one case, and then the same of Black people on the other. Like I've pretty much said, okay, in 1930s, 1940s Germany, anti-Semitism has become racism, or what we understand as like anti-Black racism would be. I don't know. I feel like this is something I would totally want to have like more of a back and forth with. Yeah. So like as you were here this week, we could definitely take time to talk more about it for sure.
Thank you, Lauren. So I'm interested in a little bit in the broader scope of your research. So what you presented is a picture where women join violence. But do you have cases where women were actually part of the organizing group, like for lynchings or these massacres, or let's say we know from the November program, these were usually men sitting and kind of plotting and then going out, right? Because the stormtroopers were anyway celebrating the failed putsch in 1923. But what about other, let's say, instances of violence throughout the 1930s you are looking at? Are women involved in organization of violence, or preparing or planning violence?
Okay, so for the German case, I would say similar. I have one or two trials that I still need to go through, where the only people on trial are women, and yeah, that's exciting. Like for instance, in northern Germany, there was a group of 4 women who were at a bathhouse somewhere, or outside, and they've got it in their heads that they want to attack the only Jewish woman bathing there. And so they get together, they collect stones, and they throw them at her and attempt to drown her. Yeah, so it does happen. I haven't covered it today, but it definitely does happen. I'm hoping that when I go through that case, actually that is one that I'm waiting to get scanned and sent to me, and this gets to another point, is when it comes to these trials, The database can say all it wants, but you can show up at the archive and they'll say something completely different. And one of the things that I've found happening, and I'm worried that it may be a case for this one as well, is that a lot of these cases that are just women being tried, the archives have decided some 20 years ago that they don't have space for these anymore. And not only are we not going to microfilm it, we're like quite literally going to throw it away. So I have traveled to a couple places and I'll say, okay, this is 12 pages. This is supposed to be 1,000 pages. Where is it? And they say, we just don't have it anymore. And it's really upsetting because it is always the trials that are just women. Like there are no men involved. And that the description, because you are left with just like the basics of what happened, is more of this women-led and motivated violence. So in that sense, I will hopefully be getting some more, and it does happen. And then for the Jim Crow side of things, definitely. I mean, women, I'm using these big moments of violence often because it's also easier in this comparison. I'll note that like I'm having a slightly harder time finding moments of like spontaneous or planned, either individual or small group violence in Nazi Germany against Jews, while on the other hand, in Jim Crow America, it's so easy to find. And I mean, it's often through testimony from someone who experienced it, like explaining the violence that they experienced and went through, and less from the perpetrator's perspective, because of course, no one did this violence. It was all done at the hands of persons unknown. But there is women-led violence there as well, often more on the street, individual, either rude remarks or like spitting is a common one. Some slight like hitting is often there as well. And I also want to add that for lynchings, while one could see a woman's action as like slightly more passive because they're maybe not like physically lighting the match or like hanging someone or shooting someone, although that did happen all the time, I would argue that denouncing someone, knowing that what is going to happen to them is to be run through the streets, to be, to be all sorts of forms of torture, depending on how big the event becomes, is physical violence and instigating it.
Thank you for the talk. I'm very experienced Muslim biblical group in Berlin. So this was very fascinating. And I have two questions. So my first question is about age. So do you notice something when you're looking at women's participation in violence? I, for example, have come across some things for Berlin, and it's interesting to notice the age, like is it younger women that's more participating more, because socialization also factored into this, given especially for like young girls who are part of the BDM and were trained in a particular way. So my first question is about age, and if you notice that as a contributing factor. And then the second thing, you do mention that women as perpetrators is not something that comes up a lot in the archives, but because women and children are like seen more in the census of civilians, I wonder if the presence of women in violence visibly in the morning on the streets was in some way used by, say, Nazi propaganda to push this narrative of spontaneous violence during the November War. So did you see anything that suggests that this was used in some way for propaganda?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for those questions. And I look forward to being able to talk more later about our projects. So for age, I'd say, I wish I could show you photos. That's the other thing. I have these great pictures that I possibly legally took at an archive that show the like you can then really see the age of the people who were involved in this pogrom, and they ranged. Like I was shocked to see some people who I was like, that could be my mother's age, like, and to think that this person is going and attacking someone. I'd say from what I've seen so far, most of them do range in their like mid to late 20s, early 30s. But there are like always kids involved. Like in every case I hear where there's a woman at the pogrom, like her kid is not that far away if she has one. And then for Jim Crow with age, it's really everyone. Like I don't really get to go into any of this in depth, but there are some really good books that talk about like the socialization of children and violence. And kids are taught very, very, very early on in the US that like not talk to them, we do not play with them. There is an us versus them. And not only is an us versus them, but that is expressed and maintained through violence. So from very early childhood on through the day they die, there's women being involved. And then, right, propaganda. I'd have to, you were specifically talking about the November program in that one? I'd have to look more. That's like an aspect that I haven't really thought of using it as propaganda about it being spontaneous. So I'm so sorry, I don't know. Yeah. Gosh, I don't know. We're just gonna go down the path. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. So a couple of acts of violence that you mentioned during this talk in the Q&A, one could categorize them as sexualized violence, such as like the forced nudity during the pogrom, the attacks in the bathhouse. Do you see it as sexualized violence? And then thinking bigger picture in terms of connecting women to perpetrating instances of sexual violence, how have you been using that to challenge these patriarchal categorizations of female violence as well?
Thank you. That's a great question. So yes, I mean, I definitely do consider these instances of sexual violence and plan on working with them further. Admittedly, have not really all that much up until now. So I guess off the cuff thought response to what I want to do or how I would see it within like situating within these patriarchal societies. Part of the point of what I'm trying to make is, yeah, this society existed, but these women knew how to express violence within it. And so whether that's making sure to do it in a private space, like a bathhouse, where there may only be women around, and you find that you can be more sexually violent in that kind of environment, or only expressing it in moments of like where there are multiple people participating and it's not an individual one-on-one. They found a way to do it. I am very much a strong advocate of they're going to do what they want, and they did.
Hi, so thank you
come
for
back.
great stuff. Oh, I'm sorry.
You're good. Keep on going.
I didn't see you.
I'm not going anywhere. So.
Okay, great. Okay, sorry. So I was first just wondering about looking at learning from the Germans by Susan Neiman when you're talking about that racialized anti-Semitism, because she does a comparison with Jim Crow racism and post-war Germany, but kind of the rise of Nazism. And then with the organizing in the South, there's a called Kitchen Table Talks, and it comes out of Black Studies, but it really is about how kitchen table was the women's business room. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there's anything about white women organizing around the kitchen table, because I feel like there's probably something there. And then the other thing was, the question I had is, in the court cases that you've been reading so far, are there instances too where women on trial then play up their femininity or their maternalism as a way to defend themselves?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Okay, so for the first one, organizing around tables, yes. Then actually one thing I also didn't touch on was how the project came to be in the first place, which was I had been taking a class. I needed to figure out what am I going to write for my final paper. This is my first semester of my PhD program. And I didn't have a dissertation topic at that time. And I had met with this professor. She suggested I look at the WKKK and a Nazi women's organization. And I was like, what? Like, I didn't know that the WKKK had its own independent organization. This is crazy. Like, I definitely want to look into it. And then there's been many years since then, but now I have my project here. And it was inspired in part by this because I had read the only book that exists on the WKKK by a sociologist named Kathleen Blee, and no hate to her, but it pretty much said that these women who she got to interview at the time, because the book came out in the 80s, were pretty much just gossips who were really good at baking and enjoyed putting together these like events at church, and she points to that they're supporting their men who are violent, but is really saying their main key of violence was was gossiping and being a poison squad of whispering women. And I was like, no, there is no way that the WKKK is not violent. And so from there, I've done a little bit of searching into, okay, if I am going to go to where these women are, if that is in the home, if there is whispering and gossiping over a kitchen table, I'm going to do what I can to get there. And so I'm so sorry if I don't get to your actual question, but I do plan on looking in this area.
So,
And then
the real question was, have you seen any women using their femininity to defend themselves?
right, that's the, yeah, exactly. So yeah, the trials are really interesting, especially because not only do they maybe play up their femininity, but they're also almost always tying it to their children and wherever their husband is. So it's, my husband either died in the war or he's away and also in a camp, a labor camp because of his actions during the war. I have 3 kids at home, I'm sick, I cannot possibly be put on trial right now. And the number of times I'll read through the first like several pages of the case, and the other Germans who are testifying, they're like, you know what, yeah, actually you can go home. Like, I'm going to dismiss this person because she has kids and because she's older or because she's ill in this way. And then only later, after loads of evidence has come up about what she's actually done, do they say, oh, well, no, actually, we are going to prosecute you for X number of time. I mean, I'd still say that women, it seems, still got off easier than the men. And their like the amount of time that they have to spend imprisoned or working in a labor camp is much less. But they definitely know what they're doing.
Yeah, right. So first of all, this is fantastic. I'm glad you guys are having this. I'm glad this was organized, because I'm also very curious about the comparison between anti-Semitism and racism, especially like just the Black community, and even, well, you know, I'm not gonna go into that, but yes, that's what I'm interested in. However, right now I'm in a master's program and I'm looking at like incarceration in LA in regards to like women and the LGBTQIA community, like 1930 through 1950. And so with that, going to archives is tricky, which people told me. But looking at sort of people that were non-binary or even like lesbians, and like looking at the newspapers and how it was described, and sort of in the newspaper, it's like, we did a raid because they were drug addicts. And then I'm looking at these photos and I'm like, I mean, I'm not going to judge you. You don't look like a drug addict, you know? And the descriptions are like, there's like needle like points on their arms and such. It's like, there's nothing to like say that that's true based on the photos. So I'm just kind of wondering, based on like your archive visits and how you said the labels were not always correct, like, how did you sort of fill in those gaps? I know you looked at the court cases, but yeah, just like other strategies you use to put the whole story together.
Well, thank you for that question. And actually, I was just reading something yesterday that's perfect for answering this question. But it's not on Nazi Germany, it's on Jim Crow. In some of the testimony, like I used a bunch of testimony to put together the brief description I gave of the East St. Louis massacre. Some of the women who came forward to say, yes, it was white women who were participating and this is what they did, they were, what is the word? They were deemed women of the underworld. So only white women of the underworld were involved in the violence. Of course, we know that's not true. And how do I go about this? I'm making sure to have multiple perspectives of the event itself, which of course is really difficult depending upon what kind of event you're talking about. Something like this massacre, you have so many different newspapers at all like national, international, even local levels. The Black press does their own perspectives on things, which I often, of course, also fall back to more often than not. In addition to finding these like 6,000 testimonies that had been sealed up until like the 80s. And so, yeah, my goal is to, using every source I possibly can, how can I look at and understand this event, and where are like the lies coming out, or where like maybe the not quite truths, or the and compiling my own story in the end, because I know they weren't all women of the underworld. I do know that it has come up many times that in certain sections of town where prostitution and other sex work was practiced, that in these areas, many people repeated that this happened here. However, at the same time, we know on the other side of town that the mayor's wife was involved or something like this. So yeah, I'm making sure to have all my ducks in a row before saying something.
Thank you. That's helpful. All right, well, with that, we'll conclude. Thank again, Gerald Breslauer, Mickey Rutman, and Tammy Anderson for funding the fellowship that brought Lauren here. So we have one more event this semester, and it's our most illustrious lecture of the year, which is on Monday, and it is about Jewish refugees in the Global South by this year's Shapiro Scholar, Atina Grossman. Please join us, and there will be, for those of you in person, you might want to know, there will be a special lunch hosted by the USC Shoah Foundation at the University Club following the lecture. So if you RSVP and space is still available, you'll be able to enjoy lunch in honor of our Shapiro Scholar. So please join us, and thank you for being here. Thank you.